The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Edwin Holloway had written it himself, every careful word, every false promise. Sitting in a Denver hotel room he shared with Victor Crow's attorney, while Lydia Mercer was already 3 days into packing her whole life into a single trunk back in Pennsylvania. He never meant to come. Not once. Not for a single moment. He signed it Your Devoted Edwin and posted it the same afternoon he collected the first payment. Why? Before we go further, if you've ever trusted someone who was counting on you not to ask questions, this story is going to hit somewhere deep. Stay with us until the very end, because what Lydia does next will surprise you. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss a story like this one, hit that like button, and drop your city and country in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to that bench. The bench was wooden, and the wood was old, and by the third morning it had memorized every bone in Lydia Mercer's body. She knew this because she could feel each one of them separately. Her left hip, her shoulder blade, the place at the base of her spine that had stopped aching and simply gone numb sometime around midnight. Numbness, she had discovered over the past 72 hours, was not the same thing as comfort. It was just the body's way of running out of arguments. The Calverton Depot sat at the edge of what the railroad company's pamphlet had generously called a growing frontier community. What it actually was a platform, a ticket window that opened 3 hours a day, a water barrel with a tin ladle chained to it, and about 40 feet of hard-packed earth between the building and the start of nothing in particular. The town, if you stretched the word, was a quarter-mile north, far enough that you had to choose to walk there, far enough that nobody from town had any reason to pass by the depot unless a train was expected. Lydia had watched 6 trains come and go. Edwin Holloway had not been on any of them. She had stopped counting the hours somewhere in the middle of the second night, when the last of her bread had gone stale enough that she'd had to soak it in water from the barrel to chew it without hurting her teeth. She was 31 years old. She had taught school for 9 years. She had written 43 letters. She had counted them, once, proudly, and received 43 back, each one so full of warmth and careful detail that she had read them until the folds wore through. She had told her sister she was finally going to have something of her own. She had told her students she was starting a new chapter. She had sold her mother's writing desk to pay for the train ticket west because Edwin's letters had said he would have everything waiting, that she only needed to bring herself and whatever small things mattered most. She had brought the letters, all 43 of them, tied with a piece of ribbon in the bottom of her trunk. That felt foolish now in a way she couldn't fully look at yet. On the first day she had been embarrassed, but not worried. Trains ran late. Men ran late. She had waited by the door of the depot with her trunk at her feet and her good traveling coat buttoned to the collar, watching the road north with the kind of patient dignity she had learned from 20 years of watching her mother wait for her father to do what he said he would do. On the second day she had been worried but not frightened. She had spoken to the depot agent, a thin man named Purvis, who smelled like tobacco and carried a pocket watch he checked more often than any situation seemed to require. Purvis had looked at her the way you look at a stray that has wandered onto your porch, not unkindly, exactly, but with the clear knowledge that you are not going to feed it. He had let her stay inside while the wind came up, and he had not charged her for the water, and that was the full extent of what passed for kindness in this arrangement. She had sent a telegram to the address Edwin had given her in Denver, then a second one to a cousin he'd mentioned in Cheyenne. Neither produced a response. On the third day, this morning, she was frightened. Frightened in the particular way that comes when fear has been present long enough that it stops feeling like an emergency and starts feeling like weather, like something you simply have to stand in. She had $11.40. Her return ticket would cost $8. That left $3.40 between herself and complete ruin, which in practical terms meant 2 or 3 days of food, depending on prices in a town she'd never been to, assuming any of the businesses there would serve a woman traveling alone who looked, she was honest enough to admit this, like exactly what she was. Someone who had been publicly wrong about something that mattered. The morning crowd, such as it was, had mostly moved on by the time she registered them looking. A group of cowboys waiting on a livestock shipment. 2 women from town who had come to receive a package and left it twice as long as necessary. An older man with a cart full of feed sacks who had stood near the water barrel for a full 10 minutes doing nothing in particular except looking at her in a way that made her grip her coat closed even though it wasn't especially cold. She had kept her back straight. She had not cried, not in public, not where anyone could see. She had been raised in a house where dignity was the one thing you kept when everything else was gone, and she intended to keep it even if it was the only thing left. But inside, underneath the straight back and the careful hands folded in her lap, something was happening that she didn't have a clean word for. Not grief exactly, not rage, though there was some of that. More like the sensation of a floor giving way, slowly, each plank at a time, while you stand very still and pretend you don't feel it going. Edwin had been so specific. That was the thing that kept turning over in her mind like a stone she couldn't stop picking up. Not vague promises, but details. The name of the church in Calverton. The minister's name. The color of the house he was building, white with green shutters, he'd written, because she had once mentioned in passing that she liked green shutters, and apparently he had remembered. The names of 2 neighbors she would meet. The kind of stove in the kitchen. He had written about the stove in 2 separate letters, once to tell her the brand, and once to tell her it had a warming shelf on the right side that would be perfect for the bread she'd mentioned baking on Sundays. You could not invent details like that without caring about the person you were writing them for. Could you? She turned that question over and over, and the only answer that kept coming back was, yes. Apparently you could. She had trusted the specificity of the details because she had thought specificity was evidence of sincerity. Careful liars, she was learning, were very, very specific. Purvis came out at 9:30 to sweep the platform. He swept around her feet without making eye contact, which was somehow worse than if he had asked her to move. She lifted her feet. He swept under them. He went back inside. She put her feet back down. A woman came out of the general store down the road and stood on her porch looking at Lydia for a long moment before going back inside. Lydia watched her go. She thought about walking into town, into that store, asking if anyone knew the name Edwin Holloway, or knew of a man looking to settle with a wife from Pennsylvania. She had thought about this for 2 days. She could not make herself do it, and she understood why. Asking meant confirming it out loud to witnesses. As long as she was simply sitting here, she was a woman waiting. The moment she walked into that store and asked, she became a woman who had been fooled. She was 31 years old, and she had never in her life been the object of pity. She found she would go to considerable lengths to avoid becoming one now. It was close to 11 when the man came. She didn't notice him arriving because she wasn't watching the road from the north. She had turned her attention toward her trunk, where she was trying to decide for the 3rd time that morning whether the sensible thing was to spend $4 on a return ticket and arrive home with $7 and a story she would spend years not telling, or to spend some smaller amount on a room and another 2 or 3 days waiting for something she was increasingly certain was never going to materialize. She was deep enough in this calculation that she almost missed him, would have missed him entirely, except that he stopped directly in front of her and stood there long enough that the shape of him entered her peripheral vision and wouldn't leave. She looked up. He was not what she would have described as remarkable. Medium height, maybe a few years older than her, wearing a coat that had been mended at both elbows, a hat that had seen considerable weather, the kind of face that doesn't announce itself. Not handsome exactly, but not plain either, just a face that had been outdoors for a long time and had the particular stillness of someone who spent most of their hours doing work that required attention. He was holding his hat in both hands, turning it slightly, a nervous gesture that was at odds with how still the rest of him was. He looked at her. Not the way the cowboys had looked at her, cataloging her obvious situation for entertainment. Not the way Purvis looked at her, embarrassed by her existence. Not the way the women from town had looked at her, sorting her into a category. He looked at her the way you look at a problem you've been thinking about and might actually have an idea for. "You'd be the woman who's been waiting here since Thursday," he said. It wasn't quite a question. She lifted her chin. "I am." He nodded. He looked at her trunk. He looked back at her. He seemed to be thinking something through very carefully, and she had the impression that this was not unusual for him, that he was a man who thought things through before he said them, possibly to a degree that most people found inconvenient. "I'm Gideon Hale," he said. "I run the Hale Ranch, 6 miles east. I heard in town you'd been left waiting." He paused. "That's a hard thing to be." She did not say anything. She was not sure she could say anything right now and keep the floor from going the rest of the way. "I don't have any claim on what you do next," he said. "You don't know me, and you've no reason to. But I've got a ranch that's been running short-handed, and a house that's bigger than it needs to be, and work I can pay honest wages for if you'd want it." He turned his hat one more time. "It's not what you came here for. I understand that. But it's real. And it's yours if you want it." He stopped talking. He waited. He did not try to persuade her further, which she would later think about. The fact that he'd said what he had to say, and then stopped and left the space for her to fill. She was a woman who had sold her mother's desk and crossed 1,200 miles for a man who had been paid to lie to her. She had $11.40. She had her trunk and 43 letters that had turned out to be fiction, and a straight back she had kept at considerable cost for 3 days. She looked at Gideon Hale. She looked at the road north toward the town where nobody had come to help her. She looked at the ticket window that opened at noon. She said, "What kind of work?" Something in him settled, just slightly, though his expression didn't change. "Whatever you're capable of," he said, "which I'd guess is more than most." She did not smile. She wasn't at a place where smiling was available, but something in her shifted, some small weight redistributed, and the floor which had been giving held. "I'll need to know the wage first," she said. "That's fair," he said, "and I'll need it in writing." He blinked, just slightly, then he nodded. "Also fair." "And I am not," she started, and then stopped. Because how to say this to a stranger? How to say, "I am not a charity case, and I am not a broken thing, and if you've come here out of pity, I would rather go home broke than accept it." But he seemed to understand without her finishing because he shook his head, once. "I know what you're not," he said quietly. "I wouldn't have asked otherwise." She stood up. Her hip protested the motion in a way that she chose to ignore. She reached down and took the handle of her trunk. Gideon Hale reached for the other handle. She let him take it. They walked to his wagon without talking, because some things are complete without any more words, and this, she would later understand, was one of them. The bench sat empty behind her. The depot platform held the shape of the 3 days she'd spent on it. The ticket window would open at noon for someone else. Lydia Mercer did not look back. She was going to regret some things about this decision. She was going to be wrong about Gideon in small ways, and he was going to be wrong about her in small ways too, and the ranch was going to be harder than she expected, and there were going to be nights in the first weeks when she lay in the dark and wondered if she had simply traded one kind of foolishness for another. She was not walking into a promise. She was walking into an unknown, and she knew it. But she had been walking away from the known for 3 days, and the known had turned out to be a lie built by careful, specific men who thought a schoolteacher from Pennsylvania wouldn't look too closely at the seams. She got up on the wagon seat. Gideon Hale untied the horse and climbed up beside her. The horse moved. The bench disappeared behind them. 6 miles east, something she didn't have a name for yet, was waiting. The wagon made a sound like an argument, one wheel slightly off, protesting every rut in the road with a rhythmic complaint that Lydia cataloged in the first mile and then stopped hearing entirely, the way you stop hearing a neighbor's dog when it barks the same note long enough. Gideon didn't talk much on the ride out. She had expected that, given what she'd observed of him in those few minutes at the depot. The man clearly rationed his words the way some people ration money, spending only what the moment required. What she hadn't expected was that his silence wouldn't feel like indifference. It felt more like the silence of someone driving a wagon who was also, somewhere behind his eyes, running through a long list of things he hadn't figured out yet. She recognized that particular silence because she lived in it herself. The land opened up around them as the town dropped back. She hadn't seen much of this country except through the depot's single grimy window, and now that she was in it, she understood something the pamphlets had gotten exactly backwards. The pamphlets had said vast, which she had read as empty, which she had imagined as lonely. What it actually was quiet, in a way that had weight to it. Not the absence of things, but the presence of a very specific kind of stillness that sat on your chest and made you breathe differently. She was not going to say this to him. She wasn't going to say much of anything until she had a better sense of what she had agreed to. "How many people at the ranch?" she asked, around the 2nd mile. He thought about it longer than the question required. "Full count? 4. Me. My hand Darnell. He's been there 12 years. A young fellow named Pete that Darnell found somewhere and vouches for. And my Aunt Clara, who handles the house and will tell you she handles everything else too, and is about 60% right." He paused. "She'll have opinions about you." "What kind of opinions?" "The loud kind," he said. She means well underneath them. Lydia considered this. And you've told her you were bringing someone back? I told her I was going to town, he said. She'll adapt. That was not precisely reassuring. Lydia filed it. The ranch came into view at what she estimated was the 4-mile mark, and her first honest reaction, the one she didn't show on her face, was that the pamphlet writers would have called it rustic and meant it as a kindness. The house was large enough, 2 stories, with the bones of something that had once been carefully built. But the fence line sagged at the eastern corner. The kitchen garden she could see from the road was barely distinguishable from the weeds competing with it. The barn needed paint badly enough that the wood had started to look tired. The whole property had the look of something that had been maintained by one person trying to be 3 people and falling behind on all 3 jobs simultaneously. She didn't say any of this either. Clara was on the porch when they pulled up, and she was exactly what Gideon's description had promised. A stout woman somewhere between 55 and 70, with white hair pinned in a way that suggested it had been fighting her all morning, and eyes that assessed Lydia from the wagon seat to her boot heels in approximately 4 seconds, and drew conclusions she was visibly not keeping to herself. Well, Clara said. This is Lydia Mercer, Gideon said. She'll be helping out, taking the spare room. Clara looked at Lydia. Lydia looked back at Clara. You're the one from the depot, Clara said. Yes, Lydia said. Clara's chin moved, not quite a nod. You eat meat? Yes. You got a problem with hard work? No. You got a problem with being told what to do? Lydia paused one deliberate beat. That depends considerably on who's telling me and whether they know what they're talking about. Clara looked at her for a long moment. Then she turned and went back inside, and a few seconds later Lydia heard what she was almost certain was a short laugh coming from the direction of the kitchen. Gideon climbed down from the wagon. He didn't smile, but something at the corner of his mouth moved in a way that wasn't entirely neutral. That went better than most, he said. The spare room was small and had a window that faced east, which Lydia decided immediately was the best thing about it. She had spent years in a room that faced a neighbor's wall. East-facing windows gave you morning light, which was the only light that was actually useful for reading without straining your eyes. The bed was narrow, and the mattress had a history, and someone had left a hook on the back of the door that held nothing, now but had clearly held something for a long time, given the wear around it. She hung her coat on it and stood in the center of the small room and let herself, for the first time in 4 days, stop performing being fine. It took about 45 seconds. Then she picked up her trunk and started unpacking. She was going to need to know what was in this house, what was in those records Gideon apparently kept somewhere, what the actual state of this ranch was versus what it looked like from the outside. She was going to need to know what she was working with before she could be useful, and being useful was the only thing she had to offer, which meant it was also the only thing she currently had to protect. She did not think about Edwin Holloway. She was very deliberate about this. She put his name in a room in the back of her mind and she closed the door, and she left it there because if she opened it right now, on this particular afternoon, in this small east-facing room, she was not going to be able to close it again quickly, and she couldn't afford that right now. Later. She would deal with that later. Later, it turned out, kept getting pushed further back. The first week was survival in the most literal practical sense. She learned where things were. She learned how Clara thought about mealtimes, which was with military precision and an unspoken contempt for lateness. She learned that Darnell was a quiet man in his late 40s, who treated her with a careful courtesy that suggested he had probably been told not to bother her, and was choosing to exceed those instructions through simple decency. She learned that Pete was 19 years old and embarrassingly young, and made Darnell visibly nervous in the way a man gets nervous when he's personally vouched for someone and is watching them do things that are not yet disqualifying but are suggestive. She learned that the kitchen garden was not dead, just badly neglected. The soil under the weeds was darker than she expected. There were tomato plants in there that had gone sideways instead of up, wrapping themselves along the ground in a kind of desperate lateral sprawl that was almost admirable. She spent the second morning on her knees in that garden for 3 hours, and Clara came out once and stood watching her without comment, and then went back inside. And when Lydia came in for midday meal, there was a cup of coffee at her place that hadn't been there the days before. She didn't mention it. Neither did Clara. That was how things worked here, in actions, not announcements. By the end of the second week, she had also located the problem that she couldn't have named from the road, but could feel in the way the ranch operated, the way conversation stopped when certain things came up, the way Gideon's jaw tightened on three specific subjects: the eastern fence line, the water rights, and a man named Crow. She learned this last name not from Gideon, but from Darnell, who had a habit of talking while he worked that seemed less like socializing and more like thinking out loud, and who mentioned Victor Crow the way you mention a recurring injury, not dramatically, just accurately, in the category of things that were an ongoing problem with no current solution. Third ranch north of here went to him last spring, Darnell said, without looking up from the fence post he was setting. Henderson's. Been there 20 years. Victor came in with a surveyor and a lawyer, and 3 weeks later the Hendersons were packing a wagon. He set the post, tested it, it held. People around here got quiet after that, quiet in a particular way. What way? Lydia asked. Darnell looked at her then. He had the eyes of a man who had watched a lot of things and was careful about what he said about them. The way people get quiet when they've decided something's too big to fight, and they don't want to admit they've decided that. She thought about the Hendersons. She thought about 20 years. She thought about the kind of man who came in with a surveyor and a lawyer and 3 weeks later told you that your 20 years didn't count. Does Gideon have documentation? She asked. For the land, for the original claim. Darnell put another post in the ground. He's got what his father left him, whether it's enough, whether it says what it needs to say. He shrugged, and the shrug was not a dismissal. It was the gesture of a man who didn't know how to read legal documents and knew he didn't know. He's got a box in the office. He looks at it sometimes. I don't think he knows what he's looking for. That night, after supper, when Clara had gone to her chair by the stove and Pete had gone to the bunkhouse, and Darnell had said good night with his hat in his hand, Lydia sat across the kitchen table from Gideon and said, "I'd like to look at your records." He had a cup of coffee going cold in front of him. He looked at her. Why? Because I taught school for 9 years. I know how to read documents. I know what surveys look like. I know what legal language sounds like when it says what it means, and when it's been written to sound like it means something it doesn't. She folded her hands on the table, not confrontationally, just precisely. And because Darnell mentioned Victor Crow twice today, and you said his name once, and every time someone says it in this house, something changes in the air. So I'd like to look at what you have. Gideon was quiet for a long moment. He turned his coffee cup a quarter turn, the way he turned his hat when he was thinking. It's in the office, he said. I'll get the box. The box was a wooden thing, old pine, with a latch that had rusted slightly but still worked. Inside was the accumulated paper history of the Hale family's relationship with this land, the original homestead filing, dated 1861. A water rights agreement from 1869 that had been signed by 3 men, 2 of whom were probably dead. A deed that had been transferred from Gideon's father to Gideon in 1891 and appeared to have been witnessed by someone whose signature was almost entirely illegible. Tax receipts going back 15 years. A map, hand-drawn, faded, that showed the property lines as Gideon's father had understood them. Lydia looked at all of it carefully. She didn't rush. She read each document twice, which meant the reading took the better part of 2 hours, and Gideon sat across the desk from her for most of it without speaking, which she appreciated more than she expected to. Around the second hour, she found the first thing. It was small, easy to miss if you weren't specifically reading for language, which most people weren't. The Water Rights Agreement from 1869 used the phrase, "the eastern boundary as established by survey," which was perfectly normal legal language except for one thing. There was no survey attached to the agreement. There was no survey referenced by name or date. The phrase assumed a survey that, as far as she could tell from this box, did not appear to exist. "This water rights document," she said. "When was the last time someone looked at the eastern boundary?" Gideon frowned slightly. "My father ran the fence line in '88. Based on what?" He opened his mouth, closed it. Based on where the fence had always been. Lydia set the document down carefully. The agreement says as established by survey. Do you have that survey anywhere? He looked at the box. He looked at the document. I don't know, he said slowly. If Crow has a survey, she said, keeping her voice level, because she didn't want to alarm him more than was useful, and your boundary agreement references a survey that you can't produce. He could argue that your eastern boundary is wherever his survey says it is. The silence in the room changed quality. "He's already moved on the Hendersons," she said. "And the Paulson place before that. Darnell mentioned it. Both times the argument was about survey discrepancies." She looked at Gideon directly. "This is how he does it. He doesn't take the land violently. He takes it on paper." Gideon had gone very still in the way he went still when he was doing the thinking behind his eyes thing. His jaw was set, but not with anger, with the particular tension of a man who is understanding something he had been almost understanding for a long time without being able to complete the thought. "I should have looked at that years ago," he said. "You didn't know what to look for," she said, and she meant it as a plain statement, not a consolation, which was why he didn't bristle at it. "Do you?" She considered the question honestly. "I know more than you do right now," she said. "I know how language works, and I know what's missing in this document. Whether I know enough?" She paused. "There's a land records office in the county seat?" "Millhaven, 40 miles. "Then we're going to need to go to Millhaven," she said. He looked at her. Something in his expression shifted, not dramatically, not in the way that would make for a good story later, just a small, careful recalibration, the look of a man updating his understanding of a situation. "All right," he said. That was the beginning. Not of the romance, which would come much later, and was its own complicated thing, but of the work, the actual work of understanding what they were up against, which turned out to be considerably larger than an eastern fence line and a missing survey. The drive to Millhaven took 2 days each way, with an overnight at a way station that charged $3 a room and provided breakfast that Lydia ate without comment, even though the coffee was primarily hot water. She used the travel time to make a list, an actual list, in the small notebook she'd brought west with her for letter-writing purposes and had not yet used, of every document in Gideon's box and every question each document raised. By the time they reached Millhaven, she had 11 questions and a hypothesis she wasn't ready to say out loud yet. The county records office was staffed by a man named Aldous Prentice, who had worked there for apparently several decades and treated every request for documents with the expression of someone being asked to do something mildly insulting. He was not obstructive exactly, just slow in a way that appeared to be principled. He brought them what they asked for in the order he felt like bringing it, and he commented on their requests with the kind of unsolicited editorial observation that suggested he had opinions about everything and felt no obligation to keep them to himself. When Lydia asked for the survey records associated with the Hale homestead, Prentice went to his files and was gone for a long time, and came back with 2 documents, one from 1863, one from 1887, and set them on the counter with the demeanor of a man delivering something he personally found uninteresting. The 1863 survey was the original. It was hand-drawn, professionally executed for its era, and it matched the map in Gideon's box closely enough to confirm that his father's 1888 fence line had been approximately correct. The 1887 survey was different. It was also professionally executed. It was signed by a surveyor named Thomas Bellard, and it placed the Hale eastern boundary approximately 300 yards west of where the 1863 survey placed it. Lydia looked at it for a very long time. She looked at the 1863 survey. She looked at the 1887 survey. She looked at the signature on both. "Do you have anything else filed under the name Victor Crow?" she asked Prentice, keeping her voice completely neutral. Prentice gave her a look that she interpreted as why. But he went to the files again. He came back with a file that was considerably thicker than the Hale file and set it on the counter with marginally more care, which told her something about how Victor Crow was regarded in this office, though she wasn't sure yet exactly what. The file showed 7 land acquisitions. 4 of them, the Hendersons, the Paulsons, and 2 families she didn't recognize, all shared a common thread. Each acquisition had been preceded by a survey conducted by Thomas Bellard. In each case, the Bellard survey had placed the property boundary in a position that differed from the original homestead filing. In each case, the difference had been enough to create a legal dispute. In each case, the dispute had been resolved in Crow's favor. She did not show any of this on her face. She copied what she needed into her notebook in her small, exact teacher's handwriting. Every number, every name, every date. She was methodical about it in a way that meant it took a long time, and she was aware of Gideon standing slightly behind her left shoulder and being very quiet. When she was done, she asked for one more thing. "The surveyor Thomas Bellard, is there a license registration for him in this office?" Prentice looked at her with the first expression she'd seen on his face that wasn't simply bureaucratic inconvenience. It was something closer to curiosity. "There would be a state registration," he said. "Not here, state capital. But if he filed surveys in this county, there would be a local record of when he was engaged and by whom." A pause. "Possibly. I'd like to see those records," she said. The record showed that Thomas Bellard had been engaged for the 1887 Hale survey by a land management company called Western Meridian Holdings. The same company had engaged him for all 4 of the other disputed surveys. Western Meridian Holdings, when she asked, produced a blank look from Prentice. He had no direct knowledge of it, but a filing address that was a post office box in Denver. She wrote that down too. Outside, in the sharp afternoon air of Millhaven's Main Street, Gideon was quiet for a minute while she put her notebook away. Then he said, "You found something." "I found several things," she said. "I need to think about what they mean before I say them out loud." "That bad?" She looked at him. "Not bad, but bigger than either of us has room for right now." She pulled on her gloves. "One question first. Your father, did he ever mention a survey dispute in 1887? Anyone coming to look at the eastern boundary?" Gideon was very still. "He mentioned someone came out," he said slowly. "A surveyor. He didn't think much of it. He said the man walked the line, made some notes, left. Never heard anything more about it." "He wouldn't have," Lydia said quietly. "If the surveyor was working for Crow, they weren't going to use it immediately. They were going to file it and wait. Wait until the time was right, and the original owners were too old or too tired or had too much trouble and not enough money to fight." She stopped. She looked up at him. "Gideon, that survey is in the county records right now. If Crow decides to use it, it already exists. You can't unfile it." "Then what do we do?" She had been turning this over since the moment she'd seen the dates on both documents. "We find out if Thomas Bellard was actually licensed to conduct surveys in this state in 1887, she said. "We find out who Western Meridian Holdings actually is. And we find the original federal homestead filing, not your copy, the federal copy, which should be in the federal land office. Because if the original homestead filing is inconsistent with what Bellard filed, that's not a discrepancy your family made. That's fraud." The words sat in the cold air between them. "You think he's done this before," Gideon said. "I think he's done this at least 5 times that are recorded in that building behind us," she said. "And I think he's done it carefully enough that most of it hasn't been challenged, because the people it was done to couldn't read the documents well enough to know what to challenge." Gideon looked at her for a long moment. The wind came up. Somewhere down the street a door banged. "I'm glad Darnell heard you were at the depot," he said finally. It wasn't a grand thing to say. It was specific and plain, and she found, unexpectedly, that it was harder to receive than a compliment would have been. She looked away and said, "We should start back before it gets dark," which was practical and true, and also meant she didn't have to figure out what to do with her face. The ride home was different from the ride out. Not warmer exactly. Neither of them was inclined toward warmth as a first language. But different in the way that things are different when you've done a serious piece of work together and both know it. The problem had grown considerably larger on this trip, which paradoxically made it feel more manageable, because it had a shape now. You could not fight a thing that had no shape. A thing with a shape you could at least face directly. She worked on her notes by lantern light at the way station that night, while Gideon slept in the next room. She wrote down everything she could remember from the documents, every detail, in case her notes from the office were incomplete. She was building a map, not of the land, but of the scheme, how it worked, where it was vulnerable, where Crow had been careful, and where, if she was right about a few things, he had been slightly less careful than he'd imagined. Because careful men made one specific mistake, in her experience. They were careful about the parts of a scheme they could see. They were less careful about the parts they assumed other people couldn't see. She wrote for 2 hours. Then she blew out the lantern and lay in the narrow bed and did not think about Edwin Holloway. She thought instead about a retired federal surveyor Darnell had mentioned once in passing, an old man named Caldwell who had worked federal land surveys in the territory for 30 years before his eyesight went, and who now lived in a place called Brackett's Crossing, 20 miles east of the ranch. Darnell had mentioned him in the context of someone who knew where the original stakes had been driven for half the homesteads in the county. She thought about the federal land office in the state capital, and what it would cost to send a formal records request, and whether she could frame the request specifically enough to get the right documents back without tipping off anyone who might report back to Crow. She thought about the fact that Crow was almost certainly watching the ranch. Not physically, he was too sophisticated for that, but watching it the way a patient man watches something he's already decided is going to be his. Watching to see if anything changed, if anyone new arrived who might be a problem. She had arrived 10 days ago. She was, in ways she was only beginning to understand, already a problem. She closed her eyes. The mattress at this way station was marginally better than the bench at Calverton Depot, which set a low bar, but she had slept on the bench and she could sleep here. She slept. In the morning, over the bad coffee, Gideon said, "When we get back, the garden. Darnell said you've been working on it." She looked at him. This seemed like an abrupt change of subject, but she was beginning to understand that with Gideon, abrupt changes of subject were often the opposite. They were returns to something he'd been thinking about for a while. "The soil's better than it looks," she said. "My mother planted it," he said. He said it the way you say something you don't usually say, flat and careful. "She died in '89. Nobody touched it much after." Lydia looked at her coffee cup. "I noticed some of the tomato plants, the ones that have gone sideways. I think they can still be trained up if the stakes go in before the end of the month. Darnell's not much for gardens." "No," she agreed. "Clara's knees." "I know." He looked at his coffee. "You don't have to do it." "I know that too," she said. He nodded. The subject closed the way his subjects closed. Not abruptly, but completely, like a door that fits its frame exactly. But something about the conversation had shifted, and she felt it, and she suspected he did too. 3 days after they returned from Mill Haven, Victor Crow's lawyer came to the ranch. He came in a good coat, on a good horse, and he knocked at the front door like someone who was accustomed to doors opening when he knocked, which this one did because Clara answered it, and Clara was constitutionally incapable of not answering a knock even when she clearly suspected bad news on the other side. The lawyer's name was Fitch. He was smooth in the specific way of men who have learned that smoothness is more effective than aggression in situations where they hold the better hand. He had papers, which he offered to Gideon in the front room with the expression of someone performing a regrettable but necessary courtesy. Lydia was not in the front room. She was in the office, where she had been working through the records for the past 3 days, building her map. But the house was not large and the walls were not thick, and she sat very still and she listened. The papers were, Fitch explained, a formal survey dispute notification. Victor Crow had engaged an independent surveyor. Fitch did not say Thomas Bellard, he said a certified and licensed professional surveyor, who had determined that approximately 320 acres of what Gideon Hale currently used as the eastern portion of his ranch fell outside the legally established boundaries of the Hale homestead claim, and therefore constituted unregistered public land, which Mr. Crow had duly applied to register under the federal land use provisions of. Gideon said, "Get out of my house." Fitch kept the smooth expression, but his delivery slowed slightly, the way a man slows when he's been interrupted and is deciding how to handle it. "Mr. Hale, I want to be clear that Mr. Crow is not looking for conflict. He is simply exercising his legal right to. I said get out." A pause. Then Fitch said with the tone of someone who has delivered bad news before and knows it lands regardless, "You have 30 days to respond formally. After that, the matter proceeds to legal filing." He set the papers on the side table. He put his hat back on. "Mr. Crow has authorized me to tell you that he would consider a private settlement should you find the legal process inconvenient." He left. The front door closed. Lydia sat in the office with the papers spread out in front of her and the new information rearranging itself inside her head. 30 days, private settlement, the language of a man who was offering you a door and was quite confident you would walk through it because the wall next to it looked solid. She got up and went to the front room. Gideon was standing at the window watching Fitch ride back up the road toward town. His hands were at his sides. His jaw was set in the way she had come to recognize as the outer edge of something much larger that he was not going to say. She picked up the papers from the side table. She read them. Then she said, 30 days is enough." He turned from the window. He looked at her. "To do what?" he said. She held the papers. "To find what he missed," she said. Because he missed something. Men who do this kind of thing always miss something. They're careful, but they're not careful about everything. They're careful about what they can see. And there is a thing in your records, and in the federal records, and in the history of Thomas Bellard's licensure that Victor Crow thinks no one is going to look for. She met his eyes. I am going to look for it. He was quiet. Outside, the wind pushed against the house. And if you don't find it, he said. I'll find it, she said. She said it with more certainty than she actually felt, because there are moments when a person needs to hear certainty more than they need to hear the truth, and this was one of them. But underneath the certainty, the part that was still very much the schoolteacher who had been wrong about Edwin and wrong about the future she'd packed her trunk for, that part was also working, sifting, turning over the map of what she knew. Because there was something. She could feel the shape of it without being able to name it yet, the way you feel a word at the tip of your tongue. It was in the dates. It was in the surveyor's name. It was in the thing that Western Meridian Holdings was and wasn't, and who it was connected to, and why it was a post office box in Denver instead of a real address. She would find it. She went back to the office, and she sat down and she picked up her pen. The 30 days did not feel like 30 days. They felt like water running through cupped hands. The faster you tried to hold them, the faster they went. Lydia had reorganized the office by the end of the first week after Fitch's visit, not because she was tidy by nature, but because she couldn't think clearly in a space where things were in the wrong order. She built a system on the desk. Original Hale documents on the left, county records copies in the center, her own notes on the right. And she worked through them with the same method she had used for 9 years to teach reading to children who hadn't known yet that reading was something they needed. Start with what you know, build outward from there, and never mistake familiarity for understanding. What she knew, Thomas Bellard had filed a survey in 1887 that displaced the Hale eastern boundary 300 yards west of where it had been since 1863. He had filed similar surveys for 4 other properties, all of which had subsequently been acquired by Victor Crow through legal filings. Western Meridian Holdings, the company that had engaged Bellard for each survey, had a Denver post office box and no physical address on record in Millhaven County. What she didn't know yet, whether Thomas Bellard had actually been licensed to conduct federal land surveys in this territory in 1887. Whether Western Meridian Holdings existed as a legal entity anywhere, and most critically, whether the original federal homestead filing for the Hale property, the one sitting in the federal land office, not Gideon's copy, matched or contradicted what Bellard had filed. She wrote to the federal land office at the state capitol on day 3. She kept the letter precise and specific, asking only for confirmation of the original filing boundaries for the Hale homestead claim filed in 1861, and giving no indication of why she was asking. She addressed it in her own name, not Gideon's, which was a small calculation. A woman asking about homestead records was, in her experience, less likely to trigger someone's attention than a man whose name was already attached to an active dispute. She wrote to the State Surveyor's Licensing Board on day 4, asking for confirmation that one Thomas Bellard held an active federal survey license in 1887. She gave a return address at the Millhaven General Post Office, where she'd arranged with the postmaster, a meticulous little man named Garth, who appeared to run his post office with a devotion that bordered on religious, to hold correspondence for her. Then she went to see old Caldwell. Darnell drove her because Gideon was needed at the ranch for reasons that Clara itemized at breakfast in the manner of a general reviewing troop deployments, and because Darnell had met Caldwell before and knew that the man did not respond well to strangers arriving unannounced without someone he recognized alongside them. Caldwell lived in a house that had been added onto several times over several decades by someone who was better at deciding to add a room than deciding where to put it, so the structure had a sideways, incremental quality, each addition slightly askew from the last. I was somewhere north of 70, and his eyesight was, as Darnell had indicated, largely gone. He moved through his own house by memory and touch, and an occasional strategic pause that suggested he was listening to the space around him. But his mind was, as became apparent within the first 5 minutes of conversation, operating at a speed and precision that made Lydia think of a very sharp tool in a worn handle. He remembered the Hale homestead. He remembered driving the original stakes in 1863 with Gideon's father, whose first name had been Thomas, a fact she hadn't known. and whom he described as a precise, careful man who had measured his property lines twice before he accepted them. He remembered where the eastern stakes had gone. He described the landscape features they'd used as reference points: a particular rock formation, a dry creek bed, a distinctive bend in the property's northern fence that he said any surveyor worth his salt would have used as a fixed reference. "You're telling me," Lydia said carefully, "that the eastern boundary as your original survey established it would have included the rock formation." Caldwell turned his face toward her with the particular attention of a man listening very precisely to what someone is actually saying versus what they appear to be saying. "I'm telling you the rock formation was east of the eastern stake," he said, "by about 40 yards. Always was. Thomas Hale used to sit on it in the evenings." She thought about the Bellard survey and the Millhaven County records. She thought about where Bellard's eastern line fell relative to Gideon's current fence. And if someone were to place the eastern boundary 300 yards west of where you put it in 1863, where would the rock formation be? A silence. "About 260 yards inside the claimed land," Caldwell said. She wrote that down. Darnell drove back mostly in silence, which she appreciated because she was doing the map in her head, building it, testing it, finding the weak points. The rock formation was a physical landmark that predated every survey, every filing, every legal document in the county records. If Bellard's survey had moved the boundary west, and the original 1863 survey stakes had stood east of that rock, then anyone who walked the land with the original survey description in hand could demonstrate the discrepancy without reference to any document Crow controlled. But she needed the original federal filing to say what she thought it said. And she needed to know whether Bellard's license had been valid in 1887. And she needed at least one of those letters to come back before day 30. Day 12. She was in the kitchen, working through her notes for the third time, when Clara set a cup of coffee beside her elbow without comment, sat down across the table and said, "How bad is it?" Lydia looked up. Clara's eyes were direct and uncomplicated, the eyes of someone who had decided she was going to ask a real question and wanted a real answer in return. "It's manageable," Lydia said, "if the records say what I think they say." "And if they don't?" Lydia put her pen down. She was honest by temperament, and dishonesty required energy she didn't currently have to spare. "Then it gets harder," she said. Clara nodded. She wrapped both hands around her own cup. "Gideon's father built this ranch from nothing," she said. "He and his wife, Gideon's mother, 30 years. Gideon was born in that room at the top of the stairs." She paused. "I watched that boy grow up on this land. I watched him take it over when his father's health went, and hold it together when it would have been easier not to." She looked at Lydia steadily. "I don't want him to lose it." "I know," Lydia said. "I wasn't sure about you at first," Clara said. "When he brought you back from the depot, I thought, another mouth, another problem." Lydia said nothing. She had thought something similar about herself at the time. "I was wrong," Clara said. She said it plainly, without any additional decoration, the way a person says something they've made a decision about and aren't going to revisit. Then she picked up her cup and went back to the stove. It was, Lydia thought, one of the more complete apologies she had ever received. Day 16. She was in the office when she heard the horse, and then Gideon's voice at the door, and then a voice she didn't recognize, higher and slightly too loud in the way of men who have decided that confidence is expressed through volume. She closed her notebook. She was going to stay in the office. She had things to do. She stayed in the office for approximately 4 minutes and then went to the front room because something about the unfamiliar voice was producing a discomfort she couldn't name, and she had learned in 31 years that unnamed discomfort, when ignored, always turned out to have a name you should have looked for earlier. The man standing in the front room was well dressed in the specific way of someone who had recently acquired the money to dress well and was still working out how to wear it. Medium height, brown hair, a coat that was too good for the weather and too new for the territory. I was talking to Gideon with his hands slightly open at his sides, in the gesture of a man presenting himself as unthreatening, which Lydia had observed over a teaching career was a posture adopted almost exclusively by people who were, in fact, planning to be threatening. He turned when she came in. He smiled. She felt the floor again. Not the giving sensation of those 3 days on the bench, but something sharper. A physical recognition in her chest that preceded anything her mind did with it. "Lydia," Edwin Holloway said, "I have been looking everywhere for you." She did not say anything for 3 full seconds, which was the time it took her to run through 4 completely different responses, discard all of them, and arrive at the one that was actually appropriate. Edwin, she said. She said it the way you say the name of a fact you have already incorporated into your understanding of the situation. Not a greeting, not an accusation, just an acknowledgement that the fact was here now, in this room, and would need to be dealt with. Gideon was watching her with the careful attention he gave to things that had suddenly changed in nature. She could feel him watching without looking at him. She kept her eyes on Edwin. "I owe you the most enormous apology," Edwin said, and his face performed the apology convincingly. There was something that looked like contrition around his eyes, something that resembled genuine distress in the slight forward angle of his posture. He had always been good at the performance of appropriate emotion. She understood now why she'd never questioned it before. She hadn't had a reason to look for the seams. "You do," she said. "There was a situation, a family matter, an emergency. I was detained, and by the time I could send word, you had already... I couldn't reach you at the depot. They told me you'd gone with..." He glanced at Gideon. He didn't complete the sentence. "You sent no telegram," she said. "I sent 2 to your address in Denver. Neither was responded to." "I was not in Denver," he said. "Lydia, I've been frantic." "You sent no letter," she said. "You sent nothing, for 16 days. "I'm here now," he said, and his voice shifted into something warmer, more private. The register he had used in person the 3 times they had met before she'd left Pennsylvania. The voice that had felt at the time like evidence of something genuine, and now sounded like a key he'd had cut for a specific purpose. "I'm here now, and I want to make this right. We can still... Everything I wrote you, everything I promised, it's still..." "Edwin," she said, "stop." He stopped. He blinked. She looked at him. Really looked. The way she'd been unable to look at the letters, because looking directly at something you trusted requires a kind of courage that is easier in retrospect. She looked at the coat that was too new for this territory. She looked at the hands that had no calluses from ranch work, no marks from fence wire, no evidence of the life he had described in 43 letters with such specific and convincing detail. "You were never building a ranch," she said. It came out quieter than she intended, and steadier, which surprised her. "You described one. Green shutters. A warming shelf on the stove. You described it in such detail that I thought details were proof." She paused. "They're not proof. They're just detail." Something in Edwin's expression changed. Just slightly. Just enough. The warmth dialed back a fraction, and behind it was something cooler, more calculating, making a rapid assessment. "I don't know what someone has told you," he started. "Nobody told me anything," she said. "I read documents." Gideon moved slightly, not toward Edwin, just a shift of weight that changed the quality of his presence in the room. Edwin registered it. "Why are you here?" Lydia asked. "The real reason. Not the apology, which we both know is theater. Why are you in this particular house, on this particular ranch, now? 16 days after you were supposed to meet me at a depot 60 miles west?" Edwin looked at her. She could see him deciding. She could actually watch him do it. It was visible in the way his eyes moved to Gideon and back to her and to the room and back to her, measuring, calculating what she knew and what she didn't, and what version of the truth was safest to offer. He chose wrong. "I heard you'd found work here," he said. "I was worried about you." "You heard," she said. "How did you hear where I was? I've been here 2 weeks. I've been to Millhaven once. I've spoken to perhaps 8 people outside this ranch." She watched his face. "Who told you I was here?" The calculation ran again. "Word travels," he said. "It does," she agreed, "particularly if someone is watching to see where I landed." The room was very quiet. Outside, the wind had come up again, which it did every afternoon here, the kind of wind that didn't have a destination, just a direction. Gideon said from where he was standing, "You should say what you came to say." Edwin looked at him. Edwin looked at Lydia. He did the calculation one more time, and this time he arrived at a different answer, not honesty exactly, but something closer to a strategic admission, the kind where you give up the smaller thing to protect the larger one. "Lydia," he said, "I made mistakes. I should not have been as specific as I was in my letters, about things that weren't yet certain. But I am here now, and I am asking you, because I believe you are a sensible woman who understands when a situation has become complicated, to come back with me, to give this another chance." His voice had the quality of something practiced. "Whatever you think you found here, whatever work you think you're doing, it isn't a future. It's a temporary arrangement. Come back with me, and I'll give you what I promised." She understood something in that moment that she had not understood before. Not the fact of his deception, she had known that for days, in the way you know something before you can prove it, but the specific shape of it. He hadn't come here to apologize. He hadn't come because he felt guilty. He had come because something about her presence on this ranch was a problem for someone, and that someone had sent him here to remove her. And the only reason her presence on this ranch would be a problem was if what she was doing in that office was getting closer to something than certain parties wanted anyone to get. "Who sent you?" she said. The warmth went out of his face entirely. Not dramatically. He was too controlled for drama, but completely. "No one sent me," he said. "Edwin." Her voice was flat. "I have been reading documents for 2 weeks. I know what Western Meridian Holdings is. I know what Thomas Bellard is. I know how many ranches have been taken using the same method, the same surveyor, the same timing." She paused. "The only person who would know I was here and know why that was a problem is the person who designed the method." She watched his face. "Is it a coincidence that you arrived 4 days after Fitch delivered the survey dispute notice? Or is it a coincidence that you know where I am at all, given that you didn't know I existed as a problem until someone told you?" Edwin was very still. "You were always going to be here," she said, and hearing herself say it out loud was a different kind of experience than thinking it had been. "Not to marry me. You never intended that. You needed me in that town at that depot so that—" She stopped. She hadn't fully assembled this part yet. There was a piece she was missing. Why had she specifically needed to be at the depot? What did her presence in Calverton accomplish for Crow that couldn't have been accomplished without her? She would figure that out later. She filed it. "Get out," she said. Edwin looked at her for a long moment. He looked at Gideon. He made one more decision. "You're going to find yourself in over your head," he said, and his voice was quiet now and not warm at all. "Victor Crow is not a man who accepts interference from—" He stopped himself. "From what?" she said. "Finish that." He didn't. He put his hat on. He walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the frame and turned back, and she could see that he wanted to say something that would give him the last word, but nothing he had was sufficient, and after a moment he left. She listened to his horse leave the yard. She did not move until the sound had faded. Then she sat down on the nearest chair because her legs were performing a minor betrayal that she had not authorized. Gideon came and stood nearby. Not close, not hovering, just nearby in the way of someone who is available without being intrusive. He did not ask if she was all right, which she appreciated because she wasn't all right, and saying so or being obliged to deny it would have cost something she didn't have. After a minute, she said, "He knew where I was. Someone told him." "I know," Gideon said, "which means Crow has someone watching this ranch, or watching Millhaven, or both." "Probably both," Gideon said. She looked at her hands. "He said something when he was threatening." He stopped himself. He was about to say something about who Crow doesn't accept interference from, and he stopped. She looked up. "What am I? A woman, a schoolteacher, a stranger. Why does Victor Crow know my name?" Gideon was quiet for a moment. "Because you went to the county records," he said. "Because Prentice in Millhaven talks. Not maliciously, just he talks. And someone hears and reports. So he knows I was in the records," she said. "He doesn't know what I found." "No." "And he sent Edwin to remove me," she said, "which means he thinks I can be removed." She straightened in the chair. The minor betrayal in her legs had passed. "He's wrong." "Yes," Gideon said simply. She stood up. She went back to the office. She sat down at the desk with her notes and her maps and her careful list of things she knew and things she didn't know yet. And she thought very hard about the question she hadn't been able to answer. Why had she needed to be at that depot specifically? The answer came to her on day 19, and it came from an unexpected direction. Clara was sorting through a kitchen drawer that had apparently become a repository for anything that didn't have another home, which in a working ranch house meant receipts, strings of various lengths, 2 keys with unknown purposes, a folded notice from the county assessor, and a letter that had apparently arrived 3 months ago and been put in the drawer instead of delivered to Gideon because Clara had decided it looked like trouble and had been waiting for the right moment to pass it on, a moment that had evidently not arrived in 3 months. Lydia found this out because Clara, in the process of sorting the drawer, found the letter and said, to no one in particular, "I suppose I should have given this to Gideon," in a tone that suggested she was partially asking forgiveness and partially looking for reassurance that the decision to hold it had been reasonable. Lydia looked at the letter. The return address was a law firm in Denver. She said carefully, "Clara, what does it say?" Clara handed it over. "I didn't open it." Lydia opened it. It was from a law firm called Marsh & Carver, and it was addressed to Gideon, and it was a notice of an impending legal challenge to the ownership of the Hale Ranch on the grounds of disputed survey boundaries, dated 3 months ago. The same challenge that Fitch had delivered in person 2 weeks ago as if it were new, except it wasn't new. It had been issued 3 months ago, and the 3-month notice period in the original letter gave Gideon a legal response window that was, she calculated rapidly, still open. Barely, but still open. Which meant that when Fitch had come with his 30-day notice, he had been presenting a deadline that was not the actual legal deadline. The actual deadline, from the original letter, gave them considerably more time. Time that Fitch had apparently been counting on them not to know they had, because Fitch had apparently been counting on the letter never reaching Gideon at all. She read the letter twice. She put it down. She sat with this for a moment. Someone had known this letter was coming. Someone had known its contents before it arrived, and someone had arranged, or at least anticipated, that it would not be delivered promptly, which meant someone had known that the Calverton area post, or the ranch itself, was going to be a place where a letter might get delayed, misdirected, or simply not delivered to the right person. She thought about a woman arriving at a depot, a stranger in town, the kind of distraction that made people look the wrong direction for a few days. The kind of event that might cause a household to be preoccupied with an unexpected arrival. She thought about the timing. She had arrived the same week this letter had come to the ranch. She had been, without knowing it, a distraction. Not accidentally, deliberately. Edwin had delivered her to Calverton at exactly the moment when Crow's legal machinery was beginning to move on the Hale property, and her arrival had ensured that the household was occupied with something other than its mail. She was not merely a victim of the scheme. She had been a working part of it. She picked up the letter and went to find Gideon. I was in the barn with Darnell, working through something with a fence post and a level that appeared to be resisting resolution. She stood in the barn door and said his name, and he looked up at the tone of it and came over immediately. She handed him the letter. She gave him time to read it. She watched his face do a careful, controlled sequence of things while he read. When he looked up, his expression was very specific. Not rage, not even anger exactly, but the look of a man who has just had a long-standing suspicion confirmed in a way that is both satisfying and deeply unpleasant. 3 months, he said. Clara thought it was trouble, Lydia said. She was right. She just didn't know what kind. Does this change the deadline? It extends it. By my reading, the legal response window from the original notice is still open for another. She did the arithmetic. 41 days, not 30. He looked at the letter again. Fitch said 30. Fitch believed this letter never arrived, she said, or he knew it was going to be delayed and built his visit around what he thought we'd believe was our only notice. Darnell had come to stand nearby. He was holding a fence post and listening with the expression of a man who had given up pretending he wasn't. Gideon looked at Lydia. You said something about a federal land office filing. I'm waiting for a response, she said. It should come to Millhaven before the end of the week. She paused. And I'm waiting on a licensing board response about Bellard. What do you think those will say? She had been thinking about this for days, turning it over, looking for the ways she might be wrong. I think the federal filing will show the 1861 boundary as Caldwell set it, she said, because the federal filing predates Bellard by 26 years, and Crow had no way to alter a federal record, only a county record. She paused. And I think there's a possibility, a real one, that Bellard's 1887 survey was conducted on an expired or improperly issued license, which would make every survey he filed legally defective. Gideon was looking at her with the particular expression she had started to recognize, the one that wasn't admiration exactly, because he wasn't the kind of man who performed admiration, but was something quieter and more considered. The look of a man updating his understanding of a person and finding the update significant. Darnell said, to no one in particular, should have looked at them letters years ago. Nobody knew what to look for, Lydia said, and she meant it the same way she'd meant it when she'd said it to Gideon in Mill Haven as a plain statement. She looked at Gideon. I need to go back to Mill Haven. I need to pick up whatever responses have come, and I need to speak to someone. Who? The county assessor, she said, and then possibly the county attorney. She hesitated. And Caldwell. I need a written statement from Caldwell about the 1863 survey. His account is the surveyor who drove those stakes. Gideon looked at her for a moment. He's 70-something, and his eyesight's gone. His memory isn't, she said, and in a legal proceeding, a certified statement from the original surveyor carries weight that a copy of a document doesn't. It's a human account. She met his eyes. It's harder to argue with. When do you want to go? Tomorrow, she said. Early. He nodded. He turned back to Darnell and the fence post as if the conversation were over, which was how he closed things. Not dramatically, but completely. She turned to go back to the house. Lydia. She turned. He was looking at her with something that hadn't been there before. Something that had been there potentially for a while, she thought, but that he was only now allowing to be visible, the way something can be present for a long time in a space before anyone turns the light on it. When Edwin was here, he said, and stopped. He tried again. When he was talking about going back with him, he paused. You weren't considering it. She looked at him. It was not quite a question and not quite a statement, and she understood that it had cost him something to say it, this carefully shaped almost question. No, she said. He nodded once. He went back to the fence post. She went back to the house. She sat in the office for a long time after that, not working, just sitting, which she almost never did. The letters on the desk didn't move. The notes didn't rearrange themselves. The map she was building in her head stayed exactly where it was, incomplete in the ways it was incomplete, solid in the ways it was solid. She thought about Gideon saying, I'd guess it's more than most on the depot platform, the first words of any real substance he'd said to her, and how she had not known at the time what to do with being seen that way. Accurately, without exaggeration, without any attempt to make her more than she was or less than she was. She thought about Edwin, who had described 43 letters worth of a life that did not exist, and how the specific details had felt like evidence and had turned out to be craft. She thought about the difference between those two things, between someone who saw you accurately and someone who described you to yourself in the terms most likely to make you trust them. Then she stopped thinking about it, because there was work to do, and she was going to do it. She picked up her pen. On the desk, underneath her notebook, was a small piece of paper she had folded and set aside 3 days ago. A figure, in her own handwriting. The number of acres in dispute, the number of ranches Crow had taken, the rough acreage of each. Added together, it was a number that was not the size of a private dispute. It was the size of something that should have had a federal response years ago. She had been thinking about that. She had been thinking about who else, beyond the county attorney, might need to know what was in those files. She added a line to her list. Federal Land Commissioner, Denver office. Outside, the afternoon wind came up the way it always did, moving through the grass in the particular direction it always moved. Consistent and indifferent and older than any of them. She kept writing. The letters came back on a Thursday. Both of them. On the same day, which was either fortunate timing or the kind of coincidence that stops feeling like coincidence when you look at it long enough. Garth the postmaster handed them over with the precise two-handed care of a man who took the handling of correspondence seriously as a professional matter, and Lydia took them to the bench outside the post office, rather than opening them inside, because she wanted to be somewhere she could react without an audience. She opened the licensing board letter first. Thomas Bellard had held a state surveying license from 1879 to 1884. It had not been renewed. His license had lapsed in the spring of 1884, 3 years before he had conducted the survey that now sat in the Millhaven County records, displacing the Hale eastern boundary by 300 yards. She read that twice. Then she set it on the bench beside her and opened the Federal Land Office letter. The federal filing for the Hale homestead claim, originally submitted in 1861 and confirmed by Federal Survey in 1863, described the eastern boundary as running from the northern fence corner south, along a line that passed, in the original surveyor's language, approximately 40 yards west of the granite outcropping known locally as Hale Rock. The current confirmed boundary per federal records had not been amended or disputed in any federal proceeding. She sat with both letters on the bench in the thin morning sun and did the arithmetic that wasn't really arithmetic, just the arrangement of facts into their correct order. Bellard had surveyed on an expired license. Every survey he had filed after 1884 was legally defective by state statute. She had looked up the statute in the county law library the day before, a thin volume that lived in a locked case in the county attorney's anteroom, and that the county attorney's clerk had allowed her to read with the expression of someone doing a significant personal favor, though she suspected the expression was the clerk's default setting. A survey conducted by an unlicensed practitioner could not be entered as evidence in a land dispute and could not form the legal basis for a boundary claim. Period. It was not a gray area. Crow's entire challenge to the Hale Ranch rested on a document that had no legal standing. She looked at the letters for another minute. Then she put them carefully in her bag, buttoned the bag, and stood up. There was a particular sensation she recognized from teaching, the moment when a student who had been struggling with a concept for weeks suddenly understood it completely, when you could see it happen in their face, that exact second of reorganization. She had always thought it was the best thing she ever got to witness. What she was feeling right now was something related to that but turned inward, the moment when the thing you've been working toward stops being theoretical and becomes simply, irreversibly true. She walked to the county attorney's office. His name was Alderman, and he was a man of roughly 60, who had the specific tiredness of someone who had been navigating a county that Crow had been systematically buying for several years. He had been polite to her when she'd visited 3 days ago. He had been politely doubtful in the way of someone who has stopped expecting problems to have solutions. She set both letters on his desk. She set beside them the copy of the Bellard survey from the county records, the copy of the original 1863 federal survey, her notes from Caldwell, and the 3-month-old letter from Marsh and Carver that had sat in Clara's kitchen drawer. She said, "The Bellard survey was filed by a man whose license had been expired for 3 years. Every boundary claim in this county that rests on a Bellard survey filed after 1884 is legally defective. That includes the Hale challenge. That includes the Henderson acquisition. That includes the Paulson filing and 2 others I have identified in the county records." She paused. "I would like to know what the county attorney's office intends to do about that." Alderman looked at the letters. He looked at the Bellard survey. He looked at her. "Where did you get the licensing information?" he said. "I wrote to the state board," she said. "Anyone could have done it." He looked at the letters again. He picked up the licensing board response. He read it the way she had read it, twice, as if the second reading might say something different. It didn't. "If this is accurate," he said slowly. "It's a certified response from the state licensing board," she said. "It's accurate." He set it down. He picked up the federal land office letter. "Read that too." His expression was doing something complicated. The look of a man who has been waiting for a thing to happen while simultaneously not believing it was going to happen and is now confronted with its arrival. "The Henderson family," she said. "They lost their ranch based on a Bellard survey from 1886. "Yes." 2 years after his license lapsed. Alderman said nothing, but he reached across his desk and picked up a pen. They talked for an hour and 40 minutes. By the end of it, Alderman had agreed to 3 things: to send a formal records inquiry to the state licensing board to confirm Lydia's finding independently, to place a temporary hold on the Hale boundary dispute pending review of the Bellard survey's validity, and to request from the county records all filings associated with Thomas Bellard's name for the past 15 years. He did not promise more than that. He was careful about what he promised, which she respected, because careless promises from official offices were how some of the current situation had been sustained this long. She shook his hand. She walked out. Outside on the Millhaven Main Street, she stood for a moment and looked at the hardware store across the road and the bank 2 doors down and the ordinary mid-morning movement of a frontier town that had been living under Victor Crow's shadow long enough that most people had stopped looking up to check if it was still there. She went to find Gideon, who was waiting at the feed store with Darnell, and when she found him, she said, "I need you to take me to Caldwell." He looked at her face. He said, Now? As soon as possible, she said. I need a written witness statement from him about the 1863 survey. Not just my notes. His actual words on paper, witnessed by someone with legal standing. Alderman? Alderman would be ideal, she said, if he'd come. Gideon thought about this for approximately 4 seconds. I'll ask him, he asked. Alderman came. The three of them, Gideon, Lydia, and the county attorney, drove out to Caldwell's sideways assembled house in the afternoon, and Caldwell received them in his front room with the particular grace of a man who has given up being surprised by what life chooses to deliver, and has decided to simply be present for whatever arrives. He gave his statement clearly, in precise language, speaking from memory with the confidence of someone who had done the same work for 30 years and knew exactly what he had done and where. He described the original survey of the Hale homestead in 1861. He described driving the eastern stakes and the specific landscape features used to establish the line. He described the rock formation, Hale Rock, he called it, confirming the name in the federal document, and its position relative to the eastern boundary. He described Thomas Hale, Gideon's father, as a man who had stood at the eastern stake and looked at his land and said only, "That'll do," in the manner of a man satisfied with something he had worked very hard for. Gideon was quiet during this part. Caldwell signed the statement. Alderman witnessed it. Lydia had brought paper and ink in her bag because she had learned over the past 3 weeks that in situations requiring documentation, it was unwise to depend on the documentation being available when you needed it. On the drive back to Millhaven, Alderman said from the back of the wagon, "Miss Mercer, how long have you been in this territory?" "Just over 3 weeks," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "And before that?" "Schoolteacher, Pennsylvania." Another pause. "You should have been a lawyer," he said. "Women can't be lawyers," she said. "No," he agreed. He sounded genuinely regretful about it. "That's a considerable waste." She didn't respond to that because it was true and didn't require her to have a feeling about it right now. She was saving her feelings for later. There were going to be a lot of them eventually, and she was trying to budget. They arrived back at the ranch late that evening to find something waiting that none of them had expected. Pete was on the porch. He had the rigid posture of someone who has been waiting with bad news long enough that the waiting has started to affect his body, and when he saw the wagon, he came down the steps quickly. "Man came," he said, "about 3 hours ago. Big fellow, good horse. Said he worked for Crow." He looked at Gideon. "He walked the eastern fence line. Just walked it. Didn't do anything. Didn't say anything to me when I asked what he was doing." He swallowed. "When he left, he said to tell you that Mr. Crow was looking forward to the proceeding." The proceeding. As if it were scheduled, as if it were already arranged. Lydia looked at Gideon. Gideon looked at the eastern fence line, which was invisible in the evening dark but present in the way things are present when you know exactly where they are. "He's not waiting for the deadline," she said quietly. "He's moving up the timeline. He knows something changed." "The county attorney's office," Gideon said. Not accusatory, just putting the pieces together. "Prentice talks," she said. "Alderman's clerk may talk, or Crow has someone in the records room." She thought about it. "It doesn't matter. He knows we've been doing something, even if he doesn't know what. He's trying to accelerate the pressure." She looked at Gideon. "We need to file our response before he files his proceeding. If we file first, we control the framing. Can we do that? Tomorrow?" "We need to try." They were back in Millhaven by 7 the next morning, which meant leaving the ranch before full light, which meant Lydia had been awake since 4, assembling the filing documents in what order she believed they needed to be presented. She had never filed a legal response. She was not a lawyer. She was a school teacher from Pennsylvania who understood how language worked and what documents said and what they didn't say, and she had spent 3 weeks learning exactly this one situation well enough to function in it. And she was aware that this was not the same as knowing the law, and she was also aware that the county attorney had agreed to assist with the filing, which was the piece that made the rest of it possible. Alderman was already at his office when they arrived. He looked like a man who had also not slept, which made her feel slightly better about her own appearance, which she had assessed in a small mirror that morning and categorized as functional. They filed at 10 in the morning. The filing included Caldwell's witness statement, the Federal Land Office letter confirming the 1861 boundary, the State Licensing Board letter confirming. Bellard's license had lapsed in 1884. A certified copy of the Bellard Survey, marked with the specific points that contradicted the federal filing, and a formal challenge to the legal validity of any county record filed on the basis of a survey conducted by an unlicensed practitioner. Alderman filed it under his own signature as county attorney. He also sent, by separate courier, a letter to the Federal Land Commissioner's office in Denver outlining the pattern of defective surveys and their association with multiple land acquisitions by Victor Crow over a period of 12 years. She had written that letter herself. She had given it to Alderman 4 days ago, and he had read it twice and made 3 small edits to the legal language and signed it. The courier left for Denver at noon. Lydia sat in Alderman's anteroom after the filing and drank a cup of coffee that the clerk brought her without being asked, which she accepted as a sign that her standing in this office had shifted to something more than an inconvenient woman with a lot of questions. She felt the same exhaustion she'd always felt after a long examination. Not the deep tiredness of defeat, but the flat, level tiredness of having used everything you had for a specific purpose and having nothing left over. Gideon came and sat beside her. He had been in and out of the anteroom all morning, talking to Alderman, talking to Darnell, who had come along and spent most of the morning leaning against the wagon outside with the patience of a man who had learned to wait for things that took time. Gideon sat in the chair beside her and was quiet, which was his default, and which she had stopped finding odd sometime in the second week at the ranch. "What happens now?" he said. "Alderman sends the filing to the court. Crow's attorney gets a copy. They have 30 days to respond." She paused. "If the federal commissioner's office takes the Denver letter seriously, there may be an investigation that runs parallel to the court filing, which would complicate things for Crow considerably." She looked at her coffee. "If Bellard's license defect holds up in court, and the federal filing confirms what it says it confirms, then the Bellard survey has no legal standing and Crow's claim collapses." "And the Henderson Ranch?" He said it carefully, the way you say things you've been thinking about and haven't had the right moment for. She looked at him. "If the Bellard surveys are invalidated across the board, the Henderson acquisition rests on the same defective foundation as the challenge to your ranch." She paused. "That would be a matter for the court, and possibly for the federal investigation, but—" She stopped herself. "But what?" "I don't want to tell you something is possible that may not happen," she said. "I've told you what the documents say. What the courts do with what the documents say is a different question." He nodded. He accepted this in the way he accepted things that were true and incomplete, without demanding that they be more than they were. They drove back that afternoon. The ranch looked the same as it always did from the road, which was a thing she had stopped taking for granted. The way a place could look unchanged on the outside while everything inside it was in motion. The kitchen garden was showing real progress now. The tomato plants she had staked 3 weeks ago were climbing instead of crawling. The fence at the eastern corner was still sagging, which nobody had had time to fix, but it had been sagging before she arrived, and it could continue to sag a little longer. Clara had made supper. She had also, without announcement, moved the extra lamp from the upstairs hallway into the office, which now had enough light to work by in the evenings without Lydia having to bring her own from the bedroom. It was the kind of gesture that Clara made instead of saying things, and Lydia understood it by now and was grateful in the same quiet register. At supper, Darnell told Pete what had happened at the county attorney's office in the specific way he had of conveying serious information, plain, sequential, with no embellishment and no editorializing, so that the listener got the facts and drew their own conclusions. Pete listened with an expression of growing disbelief that eventually resolved itself into something that was almost wonder. "She filed against Crow," he said. "Against Victor Crow?" "The county attorney filed," Lydia said. "I provided the documentation." "But you—" Pete looked at her. He was 19, and sometimes his face was entirely transparent in the way young faces are before people learn to manage them. What was on it right now was the look of someone revising a category rapidly. "You did all that? The letters and the surveyor and all of that?" "Most of it," she said. "Darnell told me about Caldwell. Gideon drove me to Millhaven twice. The postmaster held my correspondence without complaint. Alderman put his name on the filing." She looked around the table. None of it was one person. Pete appeared to consider this. "Still," he said. "Still," Darnell agreed, which from Darnell was the equivalent of a considerable speech. Clara, without looking up from her plate, said, "Eat your supper." They ate supper. 3 days later, Fitch came back. He came in the afternoon this time, without the smooth courtesy of his first visit. His coat was the same good coat, but he was wearing it differently, the shoulders slightly off, the collar turned up against a wind that wasn't especially cold. He knocked once, and when Gideon opened the door, he said, without any preliminary, "Mr. Crow would like to discuss a settlement." Gideon said nothing. Fitch looked past him, briefly, into the house. He looked at Lydia, who was standing in the doorway of the office with a document in her hand. She had heard the knock and come out, but she had not come to the front door. She stood in the interior doorway and looked at Fitch. Fitch looked at her for a moment with an expression she found interesting. Not hostility, something more specific than that. The expression of a man who has been told about a problem and has arrived to find that the problem is smaller in physical stature than the description suggested and is recalibrating. "Settlement terms," Gideon said. "Let's hear them." Fitch produced a paper. The settlement offered Gideon full title confirmation of the western portion of the ranch in exchange for ceding the eastern 300 yards, the same 300 yards in dispute, to Crow's management under a long-term lease arrangement, with a cash payment of $400. Lydia crossed the room and took the paper from Gideon's hand without asking. She read it. She handed it back. "The survey your client is using to establish the disputed boundary was filed by a man whose state license had been expired for 3 years at the time of filing," she said. "That survey has been formally challenged in county court. The federal land office confirms a boundary inconsistent with your client's claim. A certified statement from the surveyor who conducted the original 1861 survey confirms the same boundary." She paused. "Your client is offering $400 for land he doesn't currently have a legal basis to claim. And he's making that offer 2 days after a filing was sent to the Federal Land Commissioner's office in Denver." She looked at Fitch directly. "That's not a settlement offer. That's a signal that your client is aware his position is weaker than he's represented." Fitch was quiet. His expression had moved from recalibration to something that was genuinely unreadable, which she took as a sign that she had said something more accurate than he expected. "Miss..." He paused. He didn't have her name. Nobody had given it to him. "Mercer," she said. "Miss Mercer. My client's position has not changed." "I'm sure it hasn't," she said. "But the documents have changed, and the documents are what the court will be looking at." He looked at Gideon. "Mr. Hale, your ranch has been in difficulty for some years. A $400 settlement and confirmed title to the majority of your land is a real benefit under uncertain legal circumstances." "The circumstances aren't uncertain," Lydia said. "They're documented." Gideon hadn't said a word. He had been watching the exchange with his arms at his sides and his expression at its most neutral, which she had learned was not blankness, but the specific look of a man listening to everything and deciding nothing prematurely. He looked at Fitch now. "Tell your client no," he said. Fitch took the settlement paper back. He put it in his coat. He looked at Lydia one more time with the expression that was still doing that specific, complicated thing. Then he left. The door closed. Pete, who had been in the hall the entire time in the unconvincing way of a young man pretending he wasn't listening, let out a breath that was audible from 6 feet away. Clara's voice came from the kitchen. "Somebody want to tell me what just happened?" "We turned down $400, Gideon said. A pause from the kitchen. "Good," Clara said. But the next day brought something none of them had prepared for. Lydia was in the office early, working through the timeline she was building for Alderman, a document that organized every piece of evidence chronologically, the way she'd organized lessons, start with what you know and build outward. When she heard a horse in the yard, and then Darnell's voice, and then a voice she didn't recognize, and then silence that went on a little long. She went to the window. In the yard, Darnell was talking to a man on horseback. Not Fitch, not anyone she'd seen before, say, an older man, maybe 65, on a plain working horse, wearing the kind of coat that had spent considerable time outdoors without any particular concern for its appearance. He was holding an envelope, and he was not giving it to Darnell. He was waiting. She went outside. The man looked at her when she came out. He had the eyes of someone who spent a lot of time judging distance, which made sense when he said, I'm looking for the person who sent a letter to the state licensing board about Thomas Bellard. She said, "That was me." He nodded. He held out the envelope. "My name is Russell Whitmore. I was Federal Land Survey Supervisor for this territory from 1871 to 1893. Thomas Bellard worked under my office for 4 of those years." He paused. "When your letter arrived at the state board, they forwarded it to a colleague who forwarded it to me." He paused again. "I have some things to tell you about Thomas Bellard that I should have told someone a long time ago." She looked at the envelope. She looked at Whitmore. She said, "Come inside." He came inside. Clara set coffee in front of him without being asked, which was Clara's way of indicating that she had assessed someone as deserving of being fed. Lydia sat across from him at the kitchen table. Gideon came in from the yard 3 minutes later, having been told by Darnell in the way that important information traveled at this ranch, quietly, efficiently, without drama. Whitmore wrapped his hands around his coffee cup. He was a man who had been carrying something for a while, Lydia thought, and was feeling the particular relief of putting it down. "Bellard was a competent surveyor," he said, "when he was licensed. Good eye, careful notes. He left the federal office in 1884 when his contract wasn't renewed. Budget reasons. Official version." He paused. "Unofficial version is that I found an inconsistency in a survey he'd filed for a private client while still under federal contract. A boundary that didn't match the original stakes. Small enough to overlook. I didn't pursue it." He looked at the table. "I should have pursued it." "Who was the private client?" Lydia said. "A land management company," he said. "Western Meridian Holdings." The name sat on the kitchen table like something physical. "After Bellard left the federal office," Whitmore continued, "I heard his name twice more in connection with boundary disputes. Both times the disputes resolved in favor of the same party. I noted it. I told myself it was coincidence." He paused. "I retired in '93. Moved to my daughter's place south of here." He looked at Lydia. "Your letter to the licensing board was the first time anyone had put Bellard's name and the license dates and the survey record together in writing and asked the right question." Whitmore looked around the kitchen with the expression of a man not accustomed to being offered hospitality in situations that didn't require anything in return. "I'd appreciate that," he said, with the slight awkwardness of someone who hadn't said those words recently enough. Clara from the stove said, "I'll put sheets on the downstairs room." That night, after Whitmore had gone to the downstairs room and Clara had gone to her chair and Pete had gone to the bunkhouse and Darnell had said goodnight, Lydia stayed in the office. She was building the timeline document with the addition of Whitmore's information, which extended the documented pattern 4 years earlier than she'd been able to reach with county records alone. She heard Gideon in the kitchen, the sound of him making coffee, which he sometimes did late, a habit she'd noticed without commenting on. A few minutes later, he appeared in the office doorway with 2 cups. She took one. He sat in the chair across the desk that he'd occupied in Mill Haven, which had gradually become the chair he used when he came into the office at night, which happened more often than it had in the first week. "Whitmore," she said. "His notebook gives us the pattern going back to 1884. Combined with the licensing dates, the federal filing, and Caldwell's statement." She paused, organizing it. "If Bellard's surveys were deliberately falsified rather than just carelessly executed, that changes the legal category from incompetence to fraud. And if fraud is established, every acquisition based on those surveys becomes subject to reversal." "Including the Henderson Ranch," he said. "Including the Henderson Ranch," she said. "And the Paulsons. And the 2 others." She looked at the timeline. 20 years of it, Gideon. He's been doing this for 20 years. Gideon was looking at his coffee. His expression was the careful, controlled thing it always was. But there was something underneath it tonight that was different from the previous times they'd sat in this room. Something that had been changing gradually, she thought, the way things change when you spend time in close proximity to a serious problem and the person working on it. Not a dramatic shift, but a slow, tectonic one. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and you don't have to answer it." She waited. "When Edwin was here," he said you'd been a pawn in Crow's scheme, that you'd been used." He looked at her directly. Does it bother you? Not knowing all of it yet, not knowing exactly what he needed you there for." She considered it honestly, which was the only way she knew how to consider things. "It bothered me very much for about 3 days," she said. Then I decided that what bothered me about it wasn't being used, it was not seeing it coming. And I've been inside enough of this scheme now to understand that not seeing it coming was not stupidity. It was, she paused. He was very specific, very deliberate. People who are that deliberate are difficult to identify as liars because they do the work that liars usually skip. He was quiet. I was angry at myself, she said, because he had asked honestly and deserved honesty back. For trusting the letters, for selling my mother's desk, for arriving at that depot and sitting on that bench for 3 days because I couldn't make myself believe that someone had been that carefully, specifically dishonest. Your mother's desk, he said. She had mentioned it once, obliquely, and the fact that he had retained it was one of those small things that she had filed without examining too closely. It was a writing desk, she said, walnut. She wrote all her letters at it. She paused. I sold it to pay for the train ticket. Something in his face shifted in the way it did when he was doing the thinking behind his eyes. I'll replace it, he said. She looked at him. That's not... You don't need to do that. I know I don't need to, he said. I want to. He met her eyes. You came out here for a desk and a man who didn't exist. At least let me provide something real in that direction. She did not know what to do with that. She had discovered over the past 3 weeks, significantly better at receiving practical help than at receiving the gesture behind practical help. She looked at the timeline on the desk. We still have work to do, she said. I know, he said. He didn't move to go. He just sat there with his coffee, comfortable in the same room as the work. And she found after a minute that this was simply what the evening was. 2 people in a room where something important was being built, drinking coffee while the night settled around the ranch and the eastern fence held its ground. She picked up her pen. She kept writing. What she was building, document by document and date by date, was not just a defense of one ranch. She understood that now with the clarity that comes when enough pieces have assembled themselves into a shape you can finally name. It was a full accounting of what had been done and how and to whom and for how long. And when it was complete, when she had every date and every name and every defective survey and every acquired ranch organized into a sequence that any person with functioning eyes could follow from the first fraud to the most recent, she was going to send a copy to the county court, a copy to the federal land commissioner in Denver, and a copy to the territorial newspaper in the capital, whose editor, she had learned from aldermen, had been trying to write about Crow for 2 years without enough documented specifics to print safely. He was going to have the specifics now. She wrote until the lamp needed trimming. She trimmed it. She wrote until the coffee was cold. She let it be cold. Outside, the ranch was quiet, in the way it was quiet at this hour. Not empty, just resting. The tomatoes were climbing their stakes. The kitchen garden was something recognizable again. The eastern fence still sagged at the corner, which was going to be fixed this week because Darnell had said so. And when Darnell said something was going to happen, it happened. 300 yards east of that fence, a rock formation sat in the dark that an old man named Caldwell had stood beside in 1861 and marked as the reference point for the eastern boundary of this land. It had been there the whole time, patient and fixed and entirely indifferent to what anyone had filed in any county office. Just sitting there in the dark, being the truth in the specific way that physical things are true, not because anyone said so, but because they simply were. Lydia Mercer wrote on. The territorial newspaper ran the story on a Thursday. Lydia knew it was coming because the editor, a lean, deliberate man named Josiah Crane, who had ridden out to the ranch 12 days earlier with ink-stained hands and the particular hunger of a journalist who has been waiting 2 years for something he can print safely, had told her it would run when he had enough to stand behind legally. She had given him 63 pages of organized documentation. He had read all of it in the office while she watched and asked 3 questions, each one more specific than the last, and at the end he had folded his hands on the desk and said, "This is the most complete account of systematic land fraud I have seen in 20 years of this work." And she had said, "Is it enough to print?" And he had said, "Yes," with the plainness of a man who doesn't use the word unless he means it completely. The story was 6 columns. Front page. The headline read, "Survey Fraud Linked to Dozen Land Seizures. Federal Investigation Underway." Crane had confirmed the federal angle independently, which meant the Denver commissioner's office had already been moving on the letter Alderman had sent before the newspaper ever went to press. Darnell brought the paper back from town the morning it ran. He set it on the kitchen table during breakfast without comment, which was not unusual for Darnell, but the way he set it down, carefully, with intention, the way you set something down that you want people to notice, made everyone at the table look at it. Pete read the headline and looked up with his mouth slightly open. Clara read the headline and said, "About time," in the tone of someone who has been waiting for a particular bus that is running very late. Gideon read the headline and then read the first two paragraphs and then set the paper down and looked at Lydia across the table, and she looked back at him, and neither of them said anything, because some things have already been said in the doing of them, and adding words on top is just noise. The response to the newspaper story came faster than any of them expected, which told Lydia something about how many people had been waiting for exactly this kind of signal, waiting to see if anyone was going to say the thing out loud before they said anything themselves. By the end of the first week after publication, Alderman had received 4 separate letters from families who had lost land in Crow-adjacent disputes over the past decade. 3 of them described survey irregularities that matched the pattern Whitmore had documented. One of them, a woman named Mabel Sorensen, who had lost her husband's homestead 3 years earlier, had kept every document from her own dispute in a trunk under her bed because, she wrote in her letter, she had not known what to do with them but had not been able to bring herself to throw them away. Lydia read that letter twice. She understood the trunk. She understood keeping something you couldn't yet use because somewhere underneath the helplessness you believed it might eventually matter. She had done something similar with 43 letters that had turned out to be fiction. She had kept them, not out of sentiment, but because letting go of evidence before you understand what it means is a form of surrender she had never been able to make herself commit to. She wrote back to Mabel Sorensen personally. She asked specific questions about the survey and the timing and the acquiring party and the name of the surveyor. She gave the letter to Garth at the Millhaven post office herself, on a morning when she and Gideon had driven in for a meeting with Alderman about the court date. The court date had been set for 6 weeks out. The federal investigation, running parallel, was its own timeline and its own process, but Alderman had explained that the 2 proceedings would influence each other. Evidence gathered by federal investigators was admissible in the county proceeding, and the county filing had given the federal office a documented starting point that shortened their own investigation considerably. They were not working separately, they were working in the same direction. Victor Crow had, as of the date of the court filing, not appeared publicly or made any statement. His attorney Fitch had sent one response letter to Alderman's office, which was formal and careful and said nothing that conceded anything, while also, Lydia noted, carefully avoiding any direct defense of the Bellard survey's validity, which told her that Fitch knew. Fitch had known, probably for some time, that the survey was defective. The settlement offer suddenly made a different kind of sense, not an opening negotiation, but a controlled retreat, offering just enough to make the problem go away before anyone looked too closely at the foundation. They hadn't taken it. She thought about that sometimes. The $400. It was real money, the kind of money that would have meant something concrete to a ranch running tight. And Gideon had said no without hesitation once she'd said what she'd said to Fitch, and she understood that the no had not been about pride or stubbornness, or not only about that. It had been about the same thing she'd been unable to do at the depot, except a transaction designed to close a question that deserved to stay open. 3 weeks before the court date, Edwin Holloway reappeared. Not at the ranch this time, in Millhaven. She found out from Alderman's clerk, who mentioned in passing that a man matching Edwin's description had been in the county records room for most of Tuesday, which was unusual because the county records room did not typically attract visitors with good city coats and no apparent local business. She did not go to find Edwin. She did not need to. She thought about what he could be doing in the records room and came to the only conclusion that made sense. He was looking for something that, from his perspective, Lydia had missed. Something that could be used to undermine the filing, or complicate the timeline, or introduce enough ambiguity into the documented pattern to give Crow's legal team room to operate. She went to the records room herself the next morning and spent 2 hours with Prentice, who had by now developed a wary respect for her that expressed itself through slightly faster retrieval times and the occasional unsolicited observation, and she looked for what Edwin might have been looking for by looking for anything she might have missed. She found it on the second hour. Not what she had missed, what he had found. In 1879, 2 years before the Hale homestead filing, there had been a short-term grazing lease for a portion of what was now the eastern section of Gideon's ranch. The lease had been between the Territorial Land Office and a party named H. Merritt for a period of 18 months. It had expired and not been renewed and had been superseded by the homestead filing in 1861. It was legally a dead document. Superseded agreements had no standing once the homestead filing was confirmed, but it existed. And it mentioned the eastern section specifically. And in the hands of a skilled enough attorney, it could be used to argue that the eastern section had a prior use history that complicated the homestead claim. Not a winning argument, she thought, not with the federal filing and Caldwell's statement and Whitmore's testimony all aligned, but a complicating one. Enough to delay. Enough to extend. Enough to make the proceeding expensive and uncertain for long enough that Gideon might find it more practical to settle. She sat with this for a minute. Then she picked up a pen and wrote down every detail of the 1879 lease, including the expiration date, the confirmation that it had not been renewed, and the date of the homestead filing that superseded it. She wrote a one-page addendum to Alderman's filing that addressed the lease preemptively, before Crow's attorneys could raise it, explaining its legal status and its relationship to the confirmed homestead filing. If they were going to try to use it as a complication, the complication would already be addressed in the record before they raised it. You could not ambush someone with a document they had already explained. She gave the addendum to Alderman that afternoon. He read it and said, with the slight expression of someone who is surprised but is professional enough not to show it fully, "You found this yourself?" "I looked for what I might have missed," she said. "This was what I found." "And you knew they'd found it?" "I suspected," she said. "The man in the records room Tuesday." Alderman looked at the addendum. "If they raise the 1879 lease in court, this will already be in our filing." "Yes," she said. He looked at her over the top of the addendum with the same expression he'd used when he said she should have been a lawyer. He didn't say it again. He didn't need to. The 2 weeks before the court date had a specific texture that Lydia would remember later, not as anxiety exactly, but as the feeling of something very large moving very slowly towards a fixed point. There was nothing more to find, no more documents to read, or letters to send, or arguments to construct. Everything that could be done had been done. The work was complete. What happened next was not in her hands. This was, she discovered, significantly harder than the work had been. She filled the time with the ranch. The kitchen garden was producing now, actually producing, tomatoes and beans, and a late crop of squash that Clara assessed with the grudging satisfaction of someone who has standards and has seen them met. The eastern fence had been properly repaired, Darnell and Pete working together for a full day while Gideon rode the line checking posts. The barn had been partially repainted, not all of it, because there wasn't time for all of it, and Pete had run out of paint before the back wall, but 3 sides was better than none, and the wood looked less tired. She noticed these things the way you notice the state of a place when you've been in it long enough that its condition feels connected to your own. She did not examine this too closely, because examining it would require decisions she wasn't ready to make. And there were enough decisions requiring attention right now without adding more. On the last evening before the court date, she was in the office, not working, just sitting, which she still almost never did, when Gideon knocked on the open door, which he had never done before. He had always simply appeared in the doorway, which was different in a way she couldn't have explained but felt clearly. He was holding something. A box, small, wooden, not pine, darker, reddish-brown, the kind of wood that takes a polish. He set it on the desk. She looked at it. She looked at him. "Walnut," he said. "I had the furniture maker in Millhaven put it together. It's not—" He said it would take 3 months to do it properly, a proper writing desk, so for now— He stopped himself. "It's a box. For letters. Or whatever you need it for." She put her hand on the lid of the box. The wood was smooth, very smooth, the work of someone who was good at what they did. "You didn't need to do this," she said. "I know I didn't need to," he said. "I said that before." She did not say anything for a moment. The box sat on the desk between them, and the lamp made the wood look darker and warmer than it probably was in plain light. And outside the night was doing what it did here, settling itself across the land with a weight that was not oppressive but simply present. "Thank you," she said. She said it plainly and completely, which was how she'd learned to say things she meant. He nodded. He stayed in the doorway. Tomorrow, she said. Tomorrow, he agreed. He went to bed. She stayed in the office a little longer with her hand on the walnut box, not thinking about anything in particular, just being in the room with the thing he had done and what it meant that he had done it, which was something she was going to have to think about when the court proceeding was finished, and the shape of the future was somewhat less uncertain than it currently was. The county courthouse in Mill Haven was a building that took itself seriously. Red brick, high windows, the faint permanent smell of paper and old wood, and the specific staleness of rooms where consequential things had happened repeatedly, and the air had retained an impression of the weight of them. Lydia had been in courtrooms before, twice in Pennsylvania, as a witness to property disputes that her school's trustees had been involved in, and she had the same feeling she'd had then, that the room itself expected you to mean what you said. The proceeding was not a trial in the full sense. It was a formal hearing on the validity of the boundary dispute filing, with both parties presenting their documented positions, and the judge, a circuit judge named Harmon, who had ridden 3 days to get here and looked like it, presiding over what was essentially a question of whether the Bellard survey had legal standing. If it did, the dispute proceeded to a full trial. If it didn't, the challenge to the Hale Ranch collapsed. Fitch was there with 2 other attorneys Lydia hadn't seen before, which told her something about how seriously Crow was taking this now. Victor Crow himself was not there. She had been wondering about this, whether he would appear, and his absence was its own information. Men who are confident in their position appear in the rooms where their position is being decided. Men who are not confident send attorneys. Alderman presented first. He was measured and thorough, and he had the particular advantage of a man presenting a documented argument that does not require embellishment. He simply walked through it in order: the licensing dates, the federal filing, Caldwell's statement, Whitmore's testimony, the pattern of defective surveys, the parallel federal investigation. He did not editorialize. He did not ask the judge to be angry. He asked the judge to look at the dates. Fitch responded. He was smooth, as he always was, and he tried 3 things. He tried to argue that the licensing lapse was a clerical matter that did not invalidate the survey's professional methodology. He tried to suggest that the federal filing and the Bellard survey could be reconciled through a new independent survey. And he raised the 1879 grazing lease. Judge Harmon looked at the grazing lease. He looked at the addendum in Alderman's filing that addressed it. He looked at Fitch. "Counselor," he said, "this lease expired 42 years ago and was superseded by a confirmed federal homestead filing. What is your argument for its relevance?" Fitch said something careful and legal about prior use in contested territory. Judge Harmon listened with the expression of a man who is listening fully and is going to respond based on what he actually heard rather than what he hoped to hear. "The 1879 lease is noted and set aside," Harmon said. "It has no bearing on the validity of the confirmed homestead claim." One of the 2 attorneys beside Fitch wrote something on his paper. His expression was the expression of a man writing down a loss. The licensing question took longer. Fitch was genuinely skilled on this point, arguing that survey methodology rather than survey or licensing was the relevant legal standard. Alderman countered with the state statute, which was unambiguous. Harmon called a recess and spent 40 minutes in his chambers and came back with an expression that told Lydia what was coming before he opened his mouth. Under state statute, a survey conducted by a practitioner whose license has lapsed cannot be entered as valid legal documentation in a boundary dispute proceeding, Harmon said. He said it the way judges say things that are already in the record, flatly, without theater. The Bellard survey of 1887 is therefore inadmissible as the basis for the current boundary challenge. Without the survey, the challenge has no documentary foundation. He paused. The boundary dispute filing against the Hale Ranch is dismissed. The room did a thing that rooms do when something significant happens. A collective shift of breath, a brief reordering of posture, the sound of someone's chair moving. Fitch's 2 attorneys were writing things down simultaneously. Fitch himself sat very still, which told Lydia more than the writing did. Alderman shook her hand. He shook Gideon's hand. He said something to Gideon that she didn't hear because she was watching Fitch gather his papers, and she was thinking about the Hendersons and the Paulsons and Mabel Sorensen with her trunk of documents under her bed. She said to Alderman, "The other cases." "The federal investigation covers them," he said. "What happens here today is part of the record that investigation uses." He looked at her. "It won't be fast." Federal proceedings never are. But the foundation is the same defective surveys, the same pattern, the same Ballard. What we've documented here applies to all of it. The Hendersons specifically, she said. Their ranch. I know, he said. I'll be reaching out to them. He paused. You could too. She thought about the woman named Mabel Sorensen and the trunk under the bed. She thought about what it means to keep evidence you don't know what to do with because somewhere in you is the belief that it will eventually matter. She thought about how long people had been waiting for this particular thing to have a name and a documented shape. Yes, she said. I will. Outside the courthouse, Darnell was waiting with the wagon, having spent the morning in town in his own patient way. Pete was with him and had clearly been asking questions because his expression when they came out was the expression of someone who has been receiving information and is trying to calibrate how significant it is. Gideon told him in 3 sentences. Pete stared at him, then at Lydia, then back at Gideon. It's done? Pete said. The ranch is done, Gideon said. The rest of it takes longer. Darnell untied the horse. He did not say anything, but he handled the reins with a care that was slightly different from his usual efficiency, and Lydia thought that was how Darnell celebrated things, by doing the ordinary thing with more attention than it strictly required. The ride back to the ranch was different from all the other rides. It was not triumphant in any way she could have pointed to. There was no particular quality of joy, which she thought was honest. You can't feel joy and exhaustion at the same time, and she was very tired in a way that had been building for weeks, and was now, with the immediate pressure gone, making itself fully known. She sat on the wagon seat and let the landscape do what it did, opening up around her in the way that it had surprised her when she'd first come this direction, and no longer surprised her but still had a quality she did not have an adequate word for. Gideon was driving. He was quiet. She was quiet. They had, she thought, gotten very good at being quiet together in a way that was not the same as the silence of strangers. After a while he said, "What do you do next?" She looked at the road. "Write to Mabel Sorensen," she said. "Write to the Hendersons. Give Alderman what he needs for the federal record." She paused. "There's a lot of letters." "There's always a lot of letters with you," he said. He didn't say it critically. There was something in the way he said it, something dry and specific, that she recognized as the version of warmth that fit the shape of him. "Yes," she said. Another silence. "Lydia," he said. Something in the way. He said her name was different. She had heard him say it in a few registers over the past weeks, practically in the middle of a sentence that needed it. Once with alarm when she'd been on the roof of the barn retrieving a shingle that Pete had knocked off, and everyone had decided was her problem to solve. Once or twice with the particular kind of directness he used when he had something he wanted her to hear clearly. This was none of those. This was something slower. "I know you came out here for something that didn't exist," he said. He was looking at the road. "And I know you stayed because you needed to, because there was nowhere else to go right away and the work was real." He paused. He seemed to be choosing things carefully, more carefully than usual, which for him was already careful. "I'm not asking you to stay because of what you've done. For the ranch. That's its own thing, separate." He stopped. She waited. She had learned to wait for him to finish. "I'm asking you to stay," he said, "because when I come in from the fence line in the evening and the lights on in the office, something in me settles. And I've been living a long time without that settling, and I'm not inclined to go back to it." She looked at him. He was still looking at the road, which she thought was either deliberate or the result of needing something to look at that wasn't her face. "That's not a grand thing to say," he said. "No," she agreed. "I know it's not." "It's the truest thing anyone has said to me since I came west," she said, and meant it. Not because it was romantic, though it was something she didn't have the vocabulary for yet, but because it was accurate. He had said exactly what was true without dressing it up into something it wasn't, and she had come 1,200 miles on the strength of words that had been dressed up into something they weren't. And the difference between those two things was the difference between a map and a real place. He looked at her then. She said, "I'm not staying because I have nowhere to go. I want to be clear about that. I could go back. I have a sister. I have a profession. I could piece something back together." "I know," he said. "I'm staying because..." She stopped. She tried again. "The ranch is real. The work is real. The people in that house are real. She paused. You are real. And I have been through enough that isn't to know what it's worth when something is. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked back at the road. The horse kept walking. The wagon kept moving. The land did what it did. Clara will have something to say, he said after a while. Clara always has something to say, she said. She'll be glad, he said. In her way. I know, she said. I'm beginning to understand her way. He almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. When they came back to the ranch, two things happened. The first was that Clara, who had been watching for the wagon from the kitchen window with a dedication she would never have admitted to, took one look at their faces as they came through the door and said nothing at all, which was the loudest thing Clara had ever communicated. She simply turned back to the stove, and the set of her shoulders said everything that needed to be said about how she felt. The second thing was the letter, which had arrived in their absence and which Darnell had picked up in town and which was sitting on the kitchen table. It was from the Federal Land Commissioner's office in Denver. It confirmed the opening of a formal investigation into land acquisition practices in the county over a period of 20 years, citing the documentation forwarded by the county attorney's office and naming Victor Crow as the primary subject of inquiry. The letter was addressed to the county attorney. A copy had been sent to the Hale Ranch directly, which was not standard practice, which meant someone at the commissioner's office had made a deliberate decision to send it. Gideon read it. He passed it to Lydia. She read it. She set it down. Pete said, "Is that what I think it is?" "It's a federal investigation," Lydia said. Pete looked at the letter. He looked at Lydia. He looked at Gideon. "Into Crow?" "Yes." Pete sat down in a kitchen chair with the expression of someone whose understanding of what is possible has just been revised in a significant direction. Darnell leaned in the doorway with his arms folded and said nothing, but his expression was the closest thing to satisfied that Lydia had ever seen on him. Clara set supper on the table without announcing it, which was her announcement, and they ate together in the way they had eaten together every night for the past 6 weeks. Not entirely comfortably, because it was a household of people who had come to this arrangement sideways, and none of them were particularly inclined to sentiment, but genuinely. The way people eat when they have come through something together, and the something was real. Victor Crow's empire did not collapse dramatically. That was not how these things went, and Lydia had understood that from the beginning, which was why she had never promised Gideon drama. What happened instead was slower and more thorough, which was in some ways more satisfying and in other ways harder to watch. The federal investigation ran for 7 months. During that time, 3 of Crow's land acquisitions were suspended pending review. His political connections in the territorial legislature, which had kept local officials cautious about moving against him, proved significantly less valuable once the federal commissioner's office was involved. Federal investigators did not answer to territorial politicians, and Crow's relationships at the county level became liabilities rather than assets when those officials began distancing themselves from him in anticipation of what was coming. Fitch left his employ in the 3rd month. He did not make a public statement. He simply stopped appearing in proceedings associated with Crow's interests, and new attorneys appeared instead. Younger ones who had been hired in a way that suggested urgency, and who did not have Fitch's ease. Lydia thought about that sometimes, about what it meant that Fitch had known, had been operating in the service of something he knew was fraudulent for long enough that he'd built a career on it. She did not feel sympathy for him exactly, but she understood the logic of it, how you make a small compromise and then another, and then the compromises are what you are, and extraction becomes something you can't quite picture anymore. She wrote to Mabel Sorensen twice. The second letter was longer. She told Mabel specifically what documents to keep and what questions to ask the county attorney's office in her own county, which was adjacent to this one and had its own Bellard filings that Lydia had identified from the records. She told her what language to look for and what to do when she found it. She wrote the letter the way she had written lesson plans, assuming competence, supplying information, trusting the reader to do the work. Mabel Sorensen's third letter back contained a sentence that Lydia read 3 times and then folded and put in the walnut box on the desk. I had given up believing the documents would matter. You helped me remember that they do. She did not take that lightly. She did not take it as a compliment. She took it as a weight. The pleasant kind, the kind that means you are carrying something real. The Henderson family came back in the 5th month. Not to their land, not yet. That proceeding was still moving through the federal review, but to the county, to Millhaven, to file their own documentation with the investigation. They came through town, and they came to the ranch because Alderman had suggested they meet Lydia, and they were a family of three: Jim Henderson, his wife Ruth, and a daughter about 12 who had the expression of a child who has watched her parents' faces for a very long time and knows all the registers of worry. Ruth Henderson sat at the kitchen table with Lydia for 2 hours. She brought a folder of documents. Lydia went through them. The Bellard survey on the Henderson property had been filed in 1886, 2 years after his license lapsed. The pattern was identical. When they were done, Ruth Henderson looked at Lydia across the table and said, "How did you know where to look?" Lydia thought about this honestly. "I didn't," she said. "I knew what I was looking for, which is different. I was looking for the place where the story stopped making sense." She paused. The story Crow told was internally consistent. His documents agreed with each other, but they didn't agree with the older documents, and the older documents are the ones that were there before anyone had a reason to lie. Ruth looked at her. "You make it sound simple." "It wasn't simple," Lydia said. "It was just patient." She thought about that word. Patient in a way that no one expected. Because no one expected a woman who'd spent 3 days on a depot bench to sit down in an office and start reading property records. Ruth was quiet for a moment. "Is that what happened?" "That's what happened," Lydia said. "If Edwin Holloway had been a better person, none of this would have been found. The ranch would have fallen to Crow, and no one would have looked at the Bellard surveys, and the Hendersons and the Paulsons, and Mabel Sorensen would have stayed where they were, which was outside their own lives." She paused. "Occasionally something wretched turns out to have been accidentally useful." Ruth did something between a laugh and something else. Clara, who had been at the stove, did not turn around, but her shoulders moved in a way that meant she had heard and had opinions. Jim Henderson shook Gideon's hand in the yard when they left. He held it longer than a standard handshake, both of them looking at the ground slightly, the way men acknowledge something that's too large for direct address. His daughter watched this from the wagon with her arms around her knees, and the expression of a 12-year-old who is quietly deciding something about how adults function at their best. The Henderson land was restored through the federal proceeding 4 months later. The Paulson land followed 6 weeks after that. Mabel Sorensen's case took longer because it was in a different county and required a separate filing, but Alderman connected her with an attorney in her own jurisdiction who had been following the federal investigation and understood the template. Victor Crow settled with the federal government in the 9th month. The settlement was not public in all its details, but what became known, through Crane's newspaper and the territorial reporting that followed his original story, was that Crow surrendered 4 of his contested acquisitions, paid a substantial fine to the Territorial Land Authority, and accepted permanent restrictions on future land transactions in the territory. He did not go to prison. That was the thing that was hardest for Lydia to sit with, and she sat with it for a while before she accepted it. The law was not a moral document, it was a practical one, and what it had accomplished was real even if it was not complete. Edwin Holloway was gone before the investigation reached the point of questioning him directly. He had left the territory sometime in the 4th month, which she learned from Alderman, who had learned it from a federal investigator. Where he had gone was unknown. She did not look for him. She had nothing to say to him that the documents hadn't already said more precisely. She thought about him sometimes, not with the rage she'd expected, not with the grief she'd braced for, but with something more complicated and less satisfying. He had done a calculated, dishonest thing that had upended her life, and had done so for money, and had never once, as far as she could tell, felt the weight of that. She could not explain him. She could not make him make sense. She had decided at some point in the middle of the 7th month that making him make sense was not her job. Her job had been the documents. She had done her job. The first snow came on a Saturday in late autumn, which Clara predicted at breakfast with the confidence of a woman who has observed the same sky for 20 years and knows what it means when it does certain things. She was right by noon. By evening, the ranch was in the specific hush that snow makes. Not silence, but a muffled version of normal sound, as if the world had decided to turn the volume down to something manageable. Lydia stood at the window of the office, which was warmer now, because Gideon had put new weather stripping around the frame in October without announcing he was doing it, which was how he did things. The walnut box sat on the desk behind her. In it were 3 letters she hadn't answered yet. 2 related to the federal proceeding, and 1 from her sister in Pennsylvania, who had written with the particular careful tone of someone who has been worried for a long time and is not sure whether to be relieved yet. She needed to answer that letter. She had been thinking about what to say. It was harder than the legal letters, which had shapes she knew, templates she'd developed over the months. The letter to her sister required something different. It required her to say what her life was now, which meant knowing what her life was now, which she did know. She was just still finding the language for it. Gideon knocked on the open door. He had the habit of knocking now. She had never asked him to start. "Snow," he said. "I see it," she said. He came to stand beside her at the window. They stood looking at the yard going white and the barn roof accumulating the first thin layer and the fence lines showing up dark against all that pale. "I wrote to my sister," she said. "I told her I'm staying." He looked at her from the side. "She's going to want to know what I'm staying as," she said. "It seems like a reasonable question." He was quiet for a moment. "What do you want to tell her?" She thought about this. Not performing the thinking, actually doing it. "I want to tell her I'm staying as myself," she said. "Whatever else I'm staying as is a conversation for the people in this house." She paused. "In the order they choose to have it." He looked out the window. Something in his posture changed. The particular shift she had learned to read over 6 weeks of sitting in the same room with him. The shift that meant something had resolved. "Clara's going to say something," he said. "Clara is always going to say something." "She'll say it tonight, probably." "Probably," Lydia agreed. He turned from the window and looked at her with the same expression he'd had on the wagon seat after the courthouse. Not soft, not performed, just direct in the way of something that has been decided and is done being decided. "I meant what I said on the road," he said. "I know," she said. "I meant what I said back." He nodded. He looked at the snow. She looked at the snow. "The eastern fence held," he said, not changing the subject. Coming back to the same one from a different direction, the way he came back to things. "It held," she said. "All of it held," he said. She thought about a bench at a depot in Calverton. She thought about $11.40 and a trunk and 43 letters and a mother's writing desk she had sold for something that didn't exist. She thought about the look on a 12-year-old girl's face in a wagon yard, watching 2 adults do the hard thing without explanation. She thought about Mabel Sorensen's sentence, folded in the walnut box. "I had given up believing the documents would matter." She thought that the hardest thing about a long deception is not what it takes from you. It is what it almost convinces you about yourself. That you were wrong to trust, wrong to travel, wrong to believe that something you could not yet see was worth moving toward. She had come 1,200 miles toward something false. The false thing had cost her more than she could entirely count. But the false thing had also put her in a wagon with a quiet rancher on a dirt road 6 miles east of a frontier town. And the road had been real, and the ranch had been real, and the work had been real, and the people had been real, and the documents had said what they said, and the rock formation had stood where it had stood for 100 years, and the eastern boundary had held. What she had found was not what she had come looking for. It was not the green shutters. It was not the warming shelf on the right side of the stove. It was not any of the 43 specific, careful, crafted details that had made a lie feel like a life worth traveling toward. It was better than that. Better in the plain, undecorated way that true things are better than the versions of them someone built to be convincing. "Yes," she said, all of it held. Outside, the snow kept coming down on the land that was his and hers, and the people in the house, and the tomatoes that had climbed their stakes, and the eastern fence that needed watching every spring, and the rock formation that had been marking the true line all along, patient and indifferent, and entirely unmoved by what anyone had tried to file against it. Clara called from the kitchen that supper was ready, in the tone that did not invite delay. They went.